If one day your family's honor were put to the test, would you choose to remain silent and move on, or stand tall, even if it meant losing everything? In 1,883 inches, Red Willow, a small town in the Ash Creek Territory, people gathered in town hall, not to celebrate, but to witness something many dared not look at directly. A young girl named Clara Morrison, the daughter of the Morrison Ranch family, stood on a wooden platform as men one by one paid the price for her life. Not with guns, not with violence, but with money, the law, and the silence of the entire community. Her father, Elias Morrison, stood below his hands, trembling. The farm, built up over 3 generations, was on the verge of being taken away, and the only solution offered was a marriage Clara had never chosen. If it were you, what would you do? Accept the situation to keep the land, or say no and watch everything fall apart? In the middle of the room, when no one dared to speak, a man emerged from the shadows. He offered no price for Clara. He demanded nothing from her. He simply placed a bag of gold on the table, and it changed everything. This is not just a story about the Wild West. This is a story about human dignity, choice, and courage. If you're ready to step into a story that leaves you speechless and then lingers for a long time, stay with us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to begin this journey together. In 1883, Ash Creek Territory lay quietly on the northern edge of Nebraska, where the wind blew slowly and never hurried. It wasn't fertile land, nor did it promise wealth, but for those who stayed long enough, the land held a memory. It remembered every horse's hoofprint, every drought, every hastily dug grave on the scorched hillsides, and every vow spoken in silence. That morning the wind blew through the valley like an old sigh, not violent, not angry, just steady, patient, like someone who had witnessed too much loss to react strongly. On the high eastern slope, Hollow Creek Farm appeared in the pale sunlight, a low wooden house with a faded roof, a rickety fence, and a closed stable. No smoke from the chimney, no laughter, only a waiting as long as the land itself. The farm had been there for over 30 years. 3 generations of the Hawkins family had laid their hands on this land, not with contracts or seals, but with sweat bones and harsh winters. The first grandfather arrived with 2 scrawny oxen and a wagon. The father widened the fence, dug a well, and buried his wife under a cottonwood tree after a bout of malaria. And now only Caleb Hawkins remains. Caleb was old, not with the frailty of illness, but with the weariness of someone who had lived too long under the weight of responsibility. His back was slightly hunched, his shoulders no longer as straight as they were in his youth, but his eyes still held the unwavering integrity of someone who had never given up. He wore a worn wool coat, buttons askew, and boots covered in dry grass dust. He looked like the land he stood on, old-tested but never surrendered. The letter lying on the wooden kitchen table remained unfolded. It had been there for 3 days, as if Caleb hoped that if it wasn't touched, its contents would simply disappear. 30 days. 30 days to pay off a debt he never actually incurred, a debt stemming from drought, from plummeting cattle prices, from winters longer than anticipated. 30 days or Hollow Creek would be confiscated, parceled out, and sold to people who had never stooped to pick up a stone from this place. Caleb wasn't angry. He wasn't begging. He just sat there, his calloused hands resting on the table, silently listening to the wind whistling through the cracks in the door. He had lost too much to panic. His wife died when his daughter was only 10. His only son fell off his horse and died in a blizzard 7 years ago. Those losses weren't loud. They came quietly like the night dew, and then stayed. And now this piece of land, the last thing he has left, is about to slip from his grasp. On the porch, Eliza Hawkins leaned against a wooden post, her gaze fixed on the prairie. She didn't cry, not because she didn't feel pain, but because tears had become a luxury in a house that always demanded sobriety. Eliza was 27, but her eyes held the quiet serenity of someone who had lived longer than her age. She wore a simple gray dress, her hair neatly tied back, no makeup, no jewelry. In her hand was a handkerchief that had been mended many times. Eliza knew before her father told her. In this land, people learn to read anxiety from small details: suppressed sighs, less food eaten at dinner, a gaze lingering too long at the window. She had seen her father count the money in the tin box 3 times in one evening. She had heard him toss and turn in bed, though without a word of complaint. People in Ash Creek began to whisper. They weren't malicious, it was simply poverty that had eroded compassion. Some said Caleb Hawkins should sell his land soon to save face. Others said Eliza was too old to be a burden. Some offered what they called practical solutions. Eliza listened to everything, and she remained silent. She didn't see herself as a commodity, but she wasn't blind to reality either. In this frontier region, women don't have many options, especially women without a dowry, without a guardian, and with a failing farm to support. That afternoon, Caleb stepped out onto the porch. He stood beside his daughter, both gazing out at the meadow that had turned a yellowish gray. Neither spoke for a long time. Their most important conversations always took place in silence. "I'm sorry," Caleb finally said. His voice was hoarse but steady. Eliza shook her head. "Father did his best." That statement wasn't meant to be comforting. It was the truth. The sun slowly set. Hollow Creek's shadow stretched across the ground as if the house too were clinging to the last vestiges of day. The wind blew again, carrying the scent of dry grass and hot earth. Eliza bent down, picked up a handful of earth and let it slip through her fingers. This land is not just land. It is memory. It is where her mother used to grow wildflowers. It is where her brother learned to ride horses. It is where her father buried his lifelong dream. And the land, like people, never forgets. When land is taken, it isn't just soil that's lost. It's memory. It was at that very moment, before day had ended and night had yet fallen, that distant, dusty road began to show the tracks of wheels. Something was approaching Hollow Creek. Whether salvation or trial was unclear, but the land had sensed change long before. And, when people seem to have reached the depths of despair, fate often doesn't knock loudly, it quietly enters, bringing with it an unexpected choice. Clara Morrison grew up in a house where the sound of the wind often drowned out human voices. Not because her family was taciturn, but because life on the frontier taught people to be economical with words. In Hollow Creek, every word carried weight, and Clara, from a very young age, learned this by quietly observing. Clara's mother died during an unusually long winter. She was only 12 years old then, too young to fully understand the meaning of death, but old enough to feel the void it left behind. On the day her mother died, the snow fell heavily and silently. No one wept loudly. Her father stood by the window for a long time, while Clara sat by the extinguished fireplace, her hands resting on her dress, unsure what to do in the overwhelming silence. From that day on, Clara became the firekeeper. No one said it aloud. No instructions, no handover ceremony. But the next morning, when her father went to the fields earlier than usual, Clara got up on her own to light the fire. She learned how to knead the dough so the bread wouldn't be hard, how to mend clothes with coarse thread, how to listen to her father's footsteps to know when he was tired. She didn't resent him. Resentment was a luxury that families like Morrison's didn't have time for. The years that followed passed like the changing seasons. Clara grew up not on dreams but on responsibility. She knew how to saddle horses, mend fences, and distinguish the coughs of livestock at night. She knew when to be silent and when to stand tall and speak for her father. There were things she did so well that people forgot she was just a young girl. In the town of Ash Creek, Clara was viewed with mixed feelings. Some felt pity for her, some admired her, and there were also those who judged her by the cold standards of reality. 23 years old, unmarried, without a dowry, tied to a farm, on the verge of collapse. Clara heard everything but rarely reacted. She soon understood that in a world where land could be taken away with just a piece of paper, self-respect was the only thing no one could take away unless one gave it to oneself. Mornings in Hollow Creek always start early. Clara wakes up when the sky is still gray, puts on her coat and steps outside to breathe in the cool air. She likes that moment when things aren't yet demanding, when the new day hasn't yet weighed heavily on anyone's shoulders. She checks the stables, changes the water, gathers firewood. These tasks don't bring in money, but they keep life going. Her father, Thomas Morrison, was not a man of easily expressed emotions. He loved his daughter in the way of a man from the frontier with trust. He never forbade Clara from doing hard work, nor did he ever tell her, "That's not a girl's job." but in his eyes Clara sometimes saw a worry that he thought he had kept hidden. Clara knew why. The farm was running out of steam like an old man entering his final winter. The land was drier, the livestock fewer, and the numbers in the debt ledger were growing longer. Clara didn't need to read the letters to know they were being pushed to the brink. She only needed to see how long her father stood by the fence or how he procrastinated on repairing the roof. One afternoon Clara brought water to her father. A strong wind blew, carrying dry grass dust. He took the water jug, took a sip, and then returned it. They stood side by side, looking into the distance towards the dirt road leading to the town. "Father has been thinking about selling some of the land," he said, his voice even. Clara didn't turn around. "The land can't be sold piecemeal, Father." He was silent. She knew he understood. There were nights Clara lay listening to the wind whistling through the roof, thinking about the future but not daring to name it. She wasn't afraid of poverty. She was only afraid of losing what had been cherished by others for a lifetime. She thought of her mother, of how she used to stand on the porch, looking out at the fields, her hand shielding her eyes from the sun, her gaze full of hope. Clara wondered if she had the right to let things end here. But she also knew one other thing: she wasn't weak. Clara's silence was not resignation. It was like steel tempered in a low flame, not noisy but enduring. She wasn't seeking pity. She just wanted time. Time to think, to prepare, to stand firm when the inevitable happened. Older viewers, if they look at Clara, might see themselves from many years ago. They see girls who put aside their own dreams to keep their families from falling apart. They see women who were never called heroes, but who lived as true heroes. Clara never claimed to be strong. She simply did what needed to be done. That evening, as the setting sun painted the prairie red, Clara stood at her doorstep, her hand resting on the worn wooden frame. She knew these peaceful days wouldn't last. Decisions were approaching, though no one had spoken them aloud. And deep down, Clara sensed that her life was about to take a turn where silence would no longer be enough to protect her. But if that happens, she will face it. Not with tears, but with the straight back of a woman who has been accustomed to bearing responsibility since she was very young. And when a woman accustomed to standing firm in silence is placed before the gaze of the entire community, that very moment will open up an encounter no one in Ash Creek could have foreseen. Harold Whitmore didn't arrive in Red Willow with guns or on horseback. He arrived with papers, a seal, and handshakes long enough that no one dared withdraw their hand first. In this town there were men who instilled fear by shouting, banging on tables, or drawing guns. Whitmore didn't need to do that. He just needed to smile. The Red Willow Bank was on the Main Street corner, a two-story building of red brick with large windows and a sign painted in gold. It was the only building in town that was always clean, even when the wind carried dust from the prairie. Whitmore liked that. He believed that neatness created a sense of order, and order made people more compliant. That morning, Whitmore stood by the second-floor window, his hand resting lightly on the wooden slats, gazing down at the sparsely populated street below. He wore a dark coat, a neatly tied tie, and his hair was combed. There was nothing about his appearance that suggested cruelty. On the contrary, he looked like someone you could trust with money, documents, and even your future. And many people have done so. Whitmore knew every debt in the town. He knew who borrowed to buy seeds, who borrowed to bury relatives, who borrowed simply to prolong the winter. He didn't judge. Judgment was the church's job. He just recorded, added, subtracted, and waited. Time was always on the side of people like him. Sheriff Samuel Crowley entered the bank just as the clock struck 10. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face etched with the wrinkles of sun, wind, and years of law enforcement in a land that was never entirely peaceful. He removed his hat and nodded in greeting to Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore," Crowley said. Whitmore turned around, a smile playing just enough on his face. "Chief, I suppose you didn't come just to say good morning." Crowley wasn't sitting. He was standing, his hands on the brim of his hat. "There's trouble with Morrison's farm." Whitmore tilted his head as if considering something interesting. "Ah, Hollow Creek." He spoke the name of the farm as casually as mentioning a number in a ledger. But in his eyes there was a brief glimmer of light, the kind that only appears when someone sees something they've been waiting for. "The law is the law," Whitmore said. "I didn't create their circumstances." Crowley remained silent. He'd been a cop long enough to understand such sayings. They were always true on paper, and always wrong when you looked at the person. Whitmore poured tea and handed Crowley a cup. "You know, the groundwater under Hollow Creek is excellent, stable, rare in this area." He spoke as if he were merely discussing the weather. Crowley looked at Whitmore. "You've never mentioned that before." Whitmore smiled. "There are some things that are only worth talking about when the time is right." Timing. That was Whitmore's favorite word. He didn't force. He created circumstances that left others with no choice. Debt, drought laws, all were tools, and he used them with the patience of someone who believed they were doing the right thing. In town, people said Whitmore owned the bank. But those in the know understood that he owned much more than that. He owned the water through exploitation contracts. He owned the law through terms that only he had the money to pursue to the end. And he owned the silence of those who dared not oppose him. Clara Morrison first saw Whitmore one sunny afternoon. She had come to town to buy flour and salt. As she left the shop, she saw him standing in front of the bank, talking to two other men. He laughed. They laughed along. But Clara sensed something was wrong with the way they laughed, too quickly, too hastily, like people who knew they shouldn't laugh but still had to. Whitmore saw Clara. His gaze lingered longer than necessary. Not the look a man gives a woman, rather the look of someone appraising a valuable asset. He nodded in greeting. Clara returned a brief nod, then walked away. Her heart wasn't racing, but there was a chill down her spine, like when the wind suddenly changes direction. That evening, Clara recounted the story to her father. Thomas Morrison listened, saying nothing. When she finished, he simply said, "You should be careful." Clara nodded. She had always been cautious her whole life. Whitmore began to appear more frequently in town conversations. Not directly, but through others' words. Someone said the bank would tighten its grip. Someone spoke of new opportunities for waterlogged lands. These words spread slowly but surely, like oil seeping through cloth. Clara understood they were being cornered, not by threats, but by legality. And Whitmore's most terrifying thing wasn't his power, it was his belief that he was right. He believed that land should belong to those who could use it more effectively. He believed that emotions shouldn't hinder progress. And he believed that if anyone was left behind, that was the price to pay. We've all known a man like Whitmore. He never gets his hands dirty. That phrase, whispered in a church or a pub, would elicit a nod of agreement from many. Because at some point in their lives, everyone has encountered someone like that. Someone who makes you sign something you don't fully understand, and then says, "You made the choice yourself." Night fell over Hollow Creek. Clara stood by the well drawing water, listening to the creaking of the wood. She thought of Whitmore, of his flawless smile, of the feeling that some battles could not be won by brute force. But she was also thinking about something else. She thought of the people who didn't belong to the bank, who didn't belong to the town's rules, who didn't belong to the system Whitmore controlled. People who lived on the margins yet still held their honor in their own way. And for the first time in the familiar silence, Clara sensed something approaching, not noisy but unavoidable. And just when power seemed to have sealed off all avenues, an unconventional presence of red willow would step in, bringing with it a different way of life and a challenge Whitmore had never anticipated. No one in Red Willow called it a formal meeting, but everyone knew that when Harold Whitmore sent the invitation, the recipient had few options. The invitation arrived at Hollow Creek on a calm afternoon, carried by a young male boy, whose voice was childish but whose eyes were accustomed to not asking too many questions. Elias Morrison held the piece of paper in his hand for a long time. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear but from age and the accumulated sleepless nights. He read each line carefully, the black ink steady without a trace of haste. Whitmore was never in a hurry. People like him always made sure that time was on their side. Clara stood by the window, gazing out at the meadow, turning the color of the setting sun. She didn't need to ask about the contents of the letter. She just needed to see how slowly her father breathed out, as if the air in his chest had become too heavy. "He wants to see us," Elias said. His voice was hoarse, but he tried to remain calm. "At the bank. Tomorrow morning." Clara nodded. No objection, no question. She had waited for this moment, the moment when silence would no longer be enough to delay the inevitable. The next morning they arrived in town earlier than usual. Red Willow was the same. The main street was dusty, the shops were slightly ajar, a few people were chatting, but their eyes darted around more quickly when they saw the Morrison family pass by. No one spoke. But that silence carried an undeniable curiosity. The Red Willow Bank was unnaturally cool. The thick brick walls retained the chill of the previous night, making one feel as if they had stepped into a place outside of the hustle and bustle of the outside world. Whitmore was waiting. He rose as they entered, his familiar smile appearing not too wide, not too narrow, just enough to make one feel welcome. "Mr. Morrison, Miss Clara." He nodded like a polite host. "Thank you for coming." Elias sat down slowly. Clara stood beside her father, her hands clasped in front of her stomach. She didn't look at Whitmore for long. She had learned that some gazes become increasingly unpleasant the longer you look at them, like staring directly at the midday sun. Whitmore didn't beat around the bush. He never needed to. "The situation at Hollow Creek," he said, his voice even, "we're all aware of it. Debts are due. The ability to pay is limited." He turned a page as if it were just one number among hundreds. Elias swallowed hard. "I tried." Whitmore raised his hand slightly, stopping him. "I know, and I believe you." That statement, meant to be comforting, only made the room colder. "That is why I want to offer a solution." Solution. The word echoed in Clara's head like metal striking stone. "The debt will be forgiven," Whitmore continued, looking directly at Elias. "Hollow Creek Farm remains your family's property. No confiscation, no auction." Elias's eyes widened. For a moment he looked much older. A man who had prepared himself for losing everything was suddenly given hope, a hope so fragile that it made his hands tremble even more. In return, Whitmore said, his voice unchanged, "I want Clara to be my wife." The room was completely silent. There was no banging on the table, no threats, just a statement laid out as a contractual clause, clear, concise, and emotionless. Elias turned to his daughter. He wanted to say something, to protest, to stand up and leave, but his feet felt as if they were nailed to the floor. Because Whitmore wasn't holding a knife, he was holding the law. He was holding the papers Elias had signed during the hardest years, when his only option was to borrow more to survive the winter. Clara remained silent. She could feel her heartbeat steady, slow, like when she stood alone in the meadow at dawn. She wasn't shocked, nor surprised. Perhaps because deep down she knew this was what men like Whitmore considered reasonable. To him this wasn't a marriage proposal. It was a transaction. "No one is forcing you," Whitmore added, as if reading their minds. "Of course not. But time is running out." Elias gripped his daughter's hand tightly. His hand trembled noticeably. He had lived his whole life protecting his family, and now his own helplessness was putting Clara in this position. "Father," Clara said softly. Her voice didn't tremble. "I'm fine." Whitmore looked at her again. His gaze was no longer entirely cold. There was something akin to satisfaction, not of lust, but of power, a feeling that everything was going exactly as he had planned from the beginning. Clara straightened up. She looked at Whitmore, not avoiding his gaze for the first time. "I need time." Whitmore nodded. 3 days. 3 days to weigh honor against existence. 3 days to decide the fate, not only of herself, but of Hollow Creek. They left the bank in silence. Red Willow Street was still slightly noisy, but to Clara every sound seemed to fade away. Elias walked slower than usual. He didn't speak. There are pains that need no words to express. That evening Clara sat alone by the fire. The flame was small and steady, not flaring up. She thought about Whitmore, about how he called it a solution, about how the law could be used to force people to give up their most precious possessions without shedding a single drop of blood. She didn't see herself as a victim, but she felt a simmering resentment, not loud, not explosive, like embers beneath the ashes. That resentment was familiar to those who had lived long enough to understand that the most dangerous evil isn't the one that shouts, but the one that smiles and calls itself justified. Clara stood up, opened the door, and stepped outside. The night sky was vast and full of stars. The wind blew across the fields, carrying the scent of earth and grass. She took a deep breath. Whatever happened, she knew one thing: she wouldn't make a decision out of fear. Somewhere on the outskirts of town lived people who followed a different set of rules, not the rules of the bank, not the rules of paperwork. Clara had never met them. But that night she sensed that her choices might not be limited to just the two paths Whitmore had laid out for her. And when an immoral deal is presented as the only way out, it is then that a man from the fringes of society will shake the order that Harold Whitmore believed to be untouchable. That morning in Hollow Creek arrived later than usual, or perhaps that's just how Elias Morrison felt. He sat at the kitchen table watching the fading light filter through the dusty window pane, illuminating the scratches on the wooden surfaces that had been with his family for decades. Each scratch a story. A knife slipping while butchering meat. A harsh winter when the furniture had to be used for firewood. A long night when worry kept everyone awake. Elias had lived long enough to understand that some mornings bring not hope, but only decisions. Clara stood nearby, her hand resting on the gently simmering kettle. She said nothing. They had both experienced enough silent moments to know when words were superfluous. 3 days had passed since their meeting at the bank. 3 days without a word being spoken in the house, yet his presence permeated every corner of the room, every thought like a cloud that refused to dissipate. Elias couldn't sleep. Every night he lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattling the roof, and thinking about all the things a father should do and all the things he no longer had the strength to do. He thought about his wife, the woman who believed that land was what held the family together. He thought about his father, who had taught him that honor could not be mortgaged, no matter how poor one might be. And he thought about Clara. She was no longer the little girl who would run after him in the fields, her dress stained with mud. She stood there steady, her eyes calmly serene, a heart-wrenching sight. Elias looked at his daughter and realized something that made his heart ache. Clara had long since grown up, and he was still not ready to accept it. "Father," Clara said, her voice soft but clear. "I've thought about it." Elias looked up. For a moment he wanted to interrupt his son. He wanted to say that he didn't need to hear it. He wanted to say that he would rather lose his land than lose his son. But those words were stuck in his throat because he knew it's easy to say, but difficult to live with the consequences. "I will," Clara continued. "I will agree. I'll do it." Those words weren't uttered as a tragic sacrifice. They were more like the way one talks about a task that needs to be completed before nightfall. No trembling, no tears, no complaints. But it was precisely that calmness that struck Elias like a blow to the chest. "No," he said, almost in a whisper. "Father cannot." Clara shook her head. "Father has done everything he could." She stepped closer, placing her hands on the table, facing her father. "Hollow Creek is not just land. It's our family name. If we lose it, everything that you, grandfather and mother, have preserved will vanish." Elias looked at his daughter's hands, hands that had once held wooden spoons when she was too young, now calloused from labor. He saw clearly what he had tried not to name for the past 3 days. Clara didn't speak out of fear. She spoke out of a sense of responsibility. "You have no right to burden your son with this," Elias said. His voice cracked at the end of the sentence. Clara bowed her head, her gaze softening. "Father, I've been bearing this burden for a long time." That statement wasn't meant as a reproach. It was simply the truth spoken after years of silence. Clara had carried this burden since her mother's death. Since the day she became the keeper of the flame. Since the day she learned to be strong, not for praise but to survive. Elias turned away. He felt as if he were betraying everything he believed in: his honor, protecting his family, his rights as a father. But he also knew that refusing this choice meant letting Clara witness Hollow Creek being stripped of its possessions, divided up and sold to people who knew nothing of the memories buried beneath the ground. There are choices for which there is no right solution. There are only options that are less painful, and sometimes even that is not certain. Clara got up and opened the door. The morning breeze blew in, carrying the scent of dry grass and damp earth. She stepped out onto the porch and gazed at the vast prairie stretching before her. She had grown up surrounded by this landscape. Every blade of grass, every mound of earth was as familiar as her very breath. If she had to pay with her own life to preserve all of it, she would. It's not because Whitmore deserves it. It's because the Morrison family deserves it. Elias stood behind her, watching his daughter's silhouette in the dim light. In that moment, he understood that a father's greatest pain is not losing his child but watching her willingly step into a situation that he should have been in her place. That afternoon they set off for Red Willow. No one spoke. The wheels rolled steadily on the dirt road like a heartbeat forced to remain calm. When the bank came into view, Elias felt his legs grow heavy. He had never entered this place without a sense of defeat. Whitmore greeted them as if he had been waiting. He rose, his familiar smile reappearing, but this time his eyes shone a little brighter. Not because of victory, but because of the confirmation that the world still operated as he understood it. "Have you made your decision?" he asked Clara. Clara nodded. "Yes." Not another word. No conditions. No pleading. Whitmore held out papers. Pens. Ink. Everything was prepared. Elias looked at the stack of papers as if it were a verdict. He wanted to tear them up. He wanted to scream that this was wrong. But the law was on Whitmore's side, and poverty had long since deprived him of the right to choose. Clara signed her name. Her handwriting was neat and steady. When she put pen to paper, she didn't sigh with relief. She just stood still like someone who had just completed a duty without expecting any recognition. Elias couldn't bear to watch. He turned away, his hands clenched so tightly they turned white. Something inside him broke, not loudly, not collapsing, but a quiet disintegration of the belief that he had fulfilled his role. On the way home, the sky began to cloud over. Clara sat beside her father, gazing into the distance. She didn't know what life would be like. She only knew that her choice had been made consciously, and if she had to face the consequences, she would face them with her own 2 feet. But in a deeper place within her, a place even Whitmore couldn't reach, Clara sensed something else stirring. A feeling that this sacrifice, however great, wasn't the end of the story. That there were paths not found on paper. And that there were people whose lives weren't measured by debt. And when a woman accepts silent sacrifice to preserve her family's honor, it is at that very moment that fate will send her a person who had never appeared in Harold Whitmore's calculations. No one in Red Willow remembers exactly who first called that evening a marriage announcement. The word appeared on a notice posted outside Town Hall, written in bold black ink, hung neatly like an unquestionable declaration. But from the moment the first chairs were set out, when the oil lamps were hung higher than necessary, something felt amiss. Red Willow Town Hall has never been decorated like this. The spacious wooden house, once accustomed to dry town meetings and small court sessions, now took on a half-festive, half-ostentatious appearance. Ribbons hung across the main platform, wildflowers hastily arranged in mismatched glass vases. Everything seemed an attempt to name joy, but completely lacked the spirit of genuine happiness. Clara Morrison entered with her father, as the sun was setting behind the low roofs of Red Willow. She wore the simplest dress she owned, a pale gray, without lace or jewelry. Her hair was neatly tied back. She didn't want to be a part of this performance, even though she knew she was the reason for it. The moment Clara stepped through the doorway, she felt the eyes on her. Their gazes weren't like those in church, nor were they like those of long-time neighbors. They were like the gazes of a marketplace, where people look to judge, to compare, to measure the value of what they see before them. Some looked at her with curiosity, some with pity, and a few with the heavy silence of those who knew they were witnessing something wrong but lacked the courage to speak out. Harold Whitmore stood near the main platform, chatting with a few influential men in town. He looked perfectly relaxed. His suit jacket was crisp, his hair neatly combed, and his familiar smile was an integral part of his face. When he saw Clara, he nodded, his gaze lingering on her no longer than necessary, as if she were perfectly placed in the script. Elias Morrison slowed his pace. He felt the room shrinking like a clever trap wrapped in lights and pleasantries. He looked around, seeing people who had once dined at Hollow Creek, who had shaken his hand in the meadow, now avoiding his gaze or offering a polite nod. No one spoke, but the silence weighed more heavily than any accusation. The ceremony began with a speech by Whitmore. He stepped onto the platform, placed his hands on the edge of the wood, and waited for the room to fall completely silent. He didn't need to strike the gavel. His presence alone was enough to draw everyone's attention. "Today," he said, his voice low and clear, "is a memorable day for Red Willow." He spoke of the future of stability, of the good things that would come when the lands were properly managed. He mentioned Hollow Creek as a symbol of continuity, not by sentiment, but by legal ownership. Clara listened, and every word made her understand something she had only vaguely sensed before. This is not an engagement. This is a statement of power. The stage was positioned higher than necessary, leaving Whitmore constantly looking down at the crowd. Clara and Elias were invited to sit in the front row, but slightly to the side, close enough for everyone to see clearly, yet far enough so no one would mistake who was in control of the story. Whitmore didn't mention love. He didn't mention commitment. He spoke of solutions, of the common good, of a sustainable future. And each time he paused, his gaze swept over Clara, a silent reminder that she was living proof of his power. Clara sat up straight. Her hands rested on her thighs, not trembling, but something was stirring within her. She looked around the room. She saw Sheriff Samuel Crowley standing behind her, his face tense. She saw the older women holding hands, their eyes downcast. She saw the men nodding in rhythm with Whitmore's words, not necessarily in agreement, but because they were used to nodding to avoid trouble. Music began to play. A small band hired from the next town. The violin's sound was out of place, as if trying to breathe life into an atmosphere that didn't belong to it. People started to applaud, but the applause was sporadic and uneven, as if each person were wondering whether they should. Clara stood up when invited. She stepped onto the platform and stood beside Whitmore. They weren't far apart, but Clara felt as if they were in two different worlds. He looked at her, his smile unchanged. She looked down at the crowd. And it was then that Clara realized this wasn't just about her. This was a message to the whole town. A warning wrapped in lights and wildflowers. Anyone who opposed Whitmore would end up like Hollow Creek, not with bloodshed, not with arrest, just with being strangled until they had no choice. The applause erupted again, this time louder, like a collective reflex. But to Clara the sound was more like the earth falling on a coffin lid than a congratulatory cry. Elias looked at his daughter. He saw a serene face, but there was something else in her eyes, not resignation, rather a terrifying clarity. He realized that this moment, though called a celebration, resembled a funeral for the values he once believed in: freedom, choice, and honor, which cannot be bought or sold. The ceremony ended without genuine laughter. People left in silence, carrying thoughts no one dared to voice. Whitmore shook hands with each person like a master pleased with his performance. Clara stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the night air. It was dark, the wind gentle. She felt more acutely than ever that if she continued down this path, she would not only lose her future, but also become part of the machine Whitmore had built. And at the edge of the town hall's light, where the shadows began to thicken, Clara sensed a silent presence. No voice, no gesture, just the feeling that someone was watching this ceremony with eyes that did not belong to Red Willow, eyes unaccustomed to bowing before power adorned with law. And as the ceremony concluded in a deathly silence, a man emerged from beyond the town's boundaries, bearing a simple question, yet one powerful enough to shatter Harold Whitmore's entire performance. No one in Red Willow remembers exactly when the ceremony turned into a marketplace. It didn't happen suddenly. There was no hammering, no grand pronouncements. It was simply that the atmosphere in the town hall gradually changed from stifling to cold, from artificial to raw, as if a thin veil had finally been pulled away, revealing what had been there all along. Harold Whitmore stood on the platform, waiting for the murmurs to die down. He surveyed the room, his gaze leisurely and calculating. The men before him, small farm owners, traders, a few unfamiliar faces from other towns, were all familiar with the trade. Land, livestock, timber, water. For them, everything was interchangeable if the price was right. Whitmore smiled. It wasn't a malicious smile. It was eerily calm. "We all want the best," he said, his voice echoing evenly in the wooden room. "And I think Miss Morrison deserves the best possible arrangement." A brief silence. Then he continued, as if suggesting a harmless game. "Let's make sure Miss Morrison gets the best possible match." The words fell like a coin tossed on an empty table. At first no one reacted, but then a short laugh rang out from behind. A man leaned to the person next to him and whispered something, and as if a silent signal had been triggered, the atmosphere changed. Clara Morrison stood on the platform next to Whitmore. She was not forewarned. Her opinion was not sought. There was no ceremony to protect her dignity. She was simply placed there as an exhibit for everyone to look at, judge, and compare. Whitmore gestured for her to take a step forward. Clara complied. It wasn't because she was weak. Rather, she understood that resistance now would only make things worse in the way Whitmore wanted. He wanted her to rebel. He wanted her to be seen as awkward, as unreasonable. She wouldn't give him that. A man in the second row spoke first. He didn't speak loudly. He just raised his hand like at a livestock auction. $100, he said. Several people turned to look at him. Some smirked. Whitmore nodded, as if performing a formal ritual. 100, he repeated. Who else? Elias Morrison stood up abruptly. Stop, he said, his voice hoarse but firm. This Chief Samuel Crowley placed his hand on his shoulder, not forcefully but enough to stop him. Crowley didn't look at Elias. His gaze was fixed on the wooden floor, as if he couldn't bear to witness what was happening. Whitmore tilted his head. Mr. Morrison, please sit down. We're just ensuring the best possible future for your daughter. Future. From then on, in Whitmore's mouth, it became a weapon. 150, another voice called out. 175. The numbers began to rise. Not quickly, not noisily. Like how prices increase when buying a piece of land with potential. Each number thrown out carried the calmness of those who believed they had the right to do so. Clara stood still. She didn't cry. It wasn't because she wasn't in pain. It was because her tears would be seen as part of the performance. She wouldn't let her pain become entertainment for anyone in this room. She looked straight ahead over the heads of the men who were bidding for her life. Her eyes held no pleading, no begging, only the cold, detached clarity of someone who realized her dignity was being stripped bare in the spotlight. Each number sounded like a layer of clothing being peeled away. It's not about clothes, it's about honor. The older women in the room sat in silence. Some turned away. One clutched her cloth bag tightly, her knuckles turning white. They had lived long enough to understand what was happening, and long enough to know they no longer had a voice. Older audience members, if present, would not shout. They would not rise up in noisy protest. But deep within them a profound anger would well up, the silent anger of those who once believed there were boundaries no one was allowed to cross. Clara heard her voice being put on the table. 200, 220, 250. She thought of her mother. The woman who had taught her that a person's worth wasn't measured by what others were willing to pay. She thought of Hollow Creek, of the land held together by this very moment. And she understood Whitmore didn't just want to buy her, he wanted the whole town to see that nothing was unbuyable. Whitmore observed it all, a look of satisfaction in his eyes. He didn't need to participate. Just stand there, let others get their hands dirty. He remained clean, still polite, still the problem solver. One man stood up, raising his hand higher than the others. 300. A soft, faint inhale could be heard somewhere in the room. $300. A price high enough to buy back a small farm. A price for a woman standing motionless on a platform, deprived of her right to choose, turned into a commodity in the name of a better future. Clara felt her knees stiffen, not tremble. But they felt heavy. She realized that if this continued, she wouldn't be Clara Morrison anymore. She would become money, an example, a warning. Elias bowed his head. His shoulders slumped, as if the last thing keeping him upright had been taken away. In that moment, he aged 10 years. Whitmore was about to open his mouth to conclude. And it was then, when the final number was announced, when the air was as thick as the calm before a storm, that another silence fell. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of something about to change. Clara sensed it even before she saw it. A presence that did not belong to Town Hall, did not belong to Red Willow, did not belong to the rules that Whitmore was manipulating. A presence standing at the edge of the room, neither bargaining nor speaking a word, yet carrying a weight that rendered the numbers that had just been proclaimed meaningless. And when a woman's dignity is laid out on the table like the town's last remaining commodity, it is at that very moment that a man emerges from the shadows, not to haggle, but to put an end to the market that Harold Whitmore thought he controlled. No one noticed the man standing near the wooden post at the far end of Town Hall. not because he was small but because he knew how to stand in a way that kept him out of the spotlight. Jonah Gray Elk had learned that long ago from his years as an interpreter between two worlds that never truly wanted to understand each other. He knew when to speak, and more importantly when to be silent and listen. Jonah wore an old, unadorned, earth-colored coat. His black hair streaked with gray was neatly tied back. His face was weathered as if sculpted by long winters and nameless journeys. No one in town hall thought he had a right to participate in what was happening on the platform. And that's why Whitmore didn't look in his direction. Jonah had been standing there even before the auction began. He didn't join the crowd. He didn't chat. He arrived early, stood still, and observed. His eyes scanned each face, each gesture, like a weather vane, reading the wind before a storm. When the numbers were thrown out, he didn't frown. He had seen worse things given more euphemistic names. But when Clara Morrison stepped onto the stage, Jonah saw her differently. Not like those men haggling over prices. Not like Whitmore, measuring his power through the town's silence. Jonah looked at Clara as if she were a person out of place in this world. His gaze didn't sweep over her. It lingered long enough to notice her straight posture, the restraint in her eyes, and the pain that needed no display to be acknowledged. Clara felt that gaze. Not immediately. But amidst the numbers, the scattered applause and the polite nods, there was a tiny space where Jonah's gaze met hers without possessiveness. She didn't turn, but her body sensed the difference, like stepping into a cold room and suddenly feeling a gentle warmth, not enough to warm you but enough to remind you that you're not alone. Jonah Gray Elk is no stranger to Hollow Creek. Years ago, when Clara was a skinny child with a crooked braid, the Morrison family opened their barn one winter when snow covered every path. Jonah's small tribe people, who had been driven far from their water source, from their familiar land, came seeking help. There was no contract, no paperwork. Elias Morrison simply said, "The hungry eat." Jonah was younger then than he is now. His shoulders weren't hunched, his eyes were sharp. He remembered that saying, not as a debt to be repaid, but as a standard for how people should treat each other when laws aren't enough. Now, as he watched Clara stand on the platform, Jonah saw no merchandise. He saw the child who used to carry bread out onto the porch, laying it down for strangers in the cold wind. He saw the thread connecting those small acts of the past to this humiliating moment, and he knew that thread had to be broken. Whitmore continued to run his market with his usual composure. He didn't look at Jonah. To him, people like Jonah belonged on the fringes. They existed but had no influence. He believed in the system that had been set up to eliminate unwanted variables. Jonah is not a variable. He is memory. He is something that systems built on paper often forget, that people don't live by laws alone but by invisible bonds forged in the most challenging times. Chief Crowley glanced at Jonah once. Just once. His gaze lingered, then turned away. Crowley recognized the man. He had encountered Jonah in cases where the law offered no clear answers. Jonah always stood on the sidelines, said little, did much, and always left before being thanked. Jonah is waiting. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew that to change a moment like this, words had to be carefully chosen. If he spoke too soon, he would be seen as a troublemaker. If he spoke too late, Clara's dignity would be completely crushed. He looked at Whitmore. He watched how he let others pay the price for him. He watched how he kept his hands clean. Jonah had seen men like that before, in negotiations with the authorities, men who didn't fire guns but still caused people to die, a slow death. When the number 300 was announced, Jonah took a deep breath. He wasn't preparing for battle. He was preparing to say something he'd kept in his heart for a long time. But before Jonah emerged from the shadows, he looked at Clara one more time. That look didn't ask, "Do you need me?" because Jonah understood asking that question now would be pointless. He looked at her as if to say, "I see you." And Clara, even without turning around, understood. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. But in that moment, she felt what she had lacked most all evening: recognition. Not pity, not salvation, but an acknowledgement that what was happening was wrong and that someone had the courage to name it. Jonah took a step out of the shadow of the wooden post. Just one step. The sound of his shoes hitting the floor wasn't loud. but in the tense, almost impossibly silent town hall it resonated more clearly than any number that had just been called out. Whitmore turned around. For the first time that evening, his smile slowed down. Jonah Gray Elk stood upright. He didn't look at Whitmore first. He looked at Clara. Then he turned to Elias Morrison, nodding very slightly. Not a promise. Just an affirmation between men who had shared a harsh winter. When Jonah finally looked at Whitmore, his gaze held no challenge. It was calm, deep, and unbuyable. It was the look of someone who didn't need to win just to put things back in their place. Town hall fell silent. No one knew what was about to happen. But everyone sensed that the order Whitmore had built on paper and debt had just encountered something else, something that could not be signed off on or erased. An old truth. Stand still. And refuse to back down. And when the man standing in the shadows steps into the light, without any price or conditions attached, that very moment will force the entire town of Red Willow to confront a question that no contract can answer. Jonah Gray Elk's footsteps were incredibly soft. Not decisive, not ostentatious. Just the sound of his soles touching the old wooden floor, a sound usually drowned out in noisy gatherings. But that night, town hall was stretched to its limit, and so every small sound seemed more distinct. Jonah walked to the table in the center of the platform. It was the table for papers, seals, and signatures that could alter people's destinies. Whitmore turned completely around. For the first time that evening he looked directly at someone he didn't control. Jonah wasn't in a hurry. He placed a thick cloth bag on the table. It wasn't large, but it was heavy. When he released it, it made a dull metallic clang against the wood. Several people in the room held their breath. No one asked what it was. Everyone knew. Jonah opened his mouth. His voice was neither high nor low. It was as if he were speaking in a small room to acquaintances and not to the entire town. 10,000. No one laughed. No one repeated the number. No one uttered a sound of surprise. Silence fell thick and heavy like the first snow of the season falling on the steppe. Jonah continued, each word carefully chosen without emphasis. No demands. No marriage. The room fell silent. $10,000. That figure not only far exceeded all the prices just mentioned, it surpassed the imagination of those accustomed to paying in hundreds or thousands. 10,000 is the money of many consecutive good harvests. It's enough to redeem a lifetime of labor. It's a number that banks usually mention cautiously. Whitmore blinked. Just once. But it was enough to reveal what his smile had concealed all evening. 10,000, he repeated more slowly. What Jonah looked directly at Whitmore. His gaze was calm, neither contemptuous nor challenging. It was as if he were speaking to an equal, even though the two stood at opposite ends of different value systems. For the forgiveness of Hollow Creek debt, Jonah said. For the payment of all the paperwork you've set out. He paused for a moment. Without any strings attached to Clara Morrison. A subtle wave of movement swept through the room. Not noisy, but enough for everyone to feel. The men who had paid the price now avoided eye contact. The women looked up. Elias Morrison stood motionless, as if afraid that a single heavy breath would shatter the moment. Whitmore placed his hand on the table. He looked at the bag. He looked at Jonah. Then he looked at Clara. "You're breaking the agreement," he said. His voice remained calm but lacked the usual confidence. "Those are his rules," Jonah interrupted very softly. "I'm just playing along." The words weren't spoken loudly, but they carried weight, because Whitmore understood immediately what was happening. He had set up a game where money and rules were paramount, and now someone had entered that game with even more money and with an unyielding purpose. Sheriff Crowley stepped forward. He looked at Jonah, then at Whitmore. "If the amount is legitimate," he said, "then under the law, the debt can be paid in full." Whitmore turned to Crowley. "You know very well, the law is the law," Crowley said, repeating the very phrase Whitmore had used countless times. In that moment, Whitmore realized he was standing before the very mirror he himself had hung up for the entire town to look into, and the reflection was no longer under his control. Clara Morrison stood still on the platform. She didn't fully understand where the $10,000 had come from. She didn't know how Jonah had managed to raise it. But she understood one thing for sure. For the first time that evening, her name wasn't mentioned as part of the deal. Jonah didn't look at Clara as he spoke. Not out of indifference, but because he didn't want to make her the central figure in the negotiations. To him, this wasn't about bribery. It was about restoring order. Whitmore took a deep breath. He calculated. He was always good at it. But every path he tried led to the same point. If he refused, he would have to admit that everything he had just done wasn't for the law but for personal power. And that, in front of the whole town, was a risk he couldn't accept. 10,000, he said again slowly. No bargaining. Jonah nodded. No marriage. Jonah nodded again. Whitmore looked around. The eyes that had once been downcast were now looking straight ahead, not defiant, but no longer unconditionally submissive. "Okay," Whitmore said. "Deal." The word fell like a sharp cut. Silent, but decisive. Jonah opened the bag. A golden gleam shone under the oil lamp, not dazzling but enough for everyone to see that these were not empty words. Whitmore signaled to his secretary. Papers were brought out. The seal was affixed. Elias Morrison felt his knees give way. He sat down in his chair, his hands trembling. Not from weakness, but because the burden that had weighed on his chest for so long had just been lifted in a way he had never dared to hope for. Clara looked at Jonah. This time he turned to look at her. Not for long, not deeply, but enough for Clara to understand he wasn't doing this for thanks. He was doing it for something older, something deeper, a norm he carried with him from winters when no one survived alone. Whitmore signed his name. His handwriting was still neat, but his hand was no longer entirely steady. He had lost not because he lacked money, but because he lacked what Jonah possessed, the ability to stand outside the power game and still win. When it was all over, no one applauded. No one cheered. But in that room a sense of relief spread slowly, like when the last storm has passed without sweeping everything away. Clara stepped down from the platform. No one blocked her path anymore. No more judgmental stares. Only other looks, reserved, respectful, and for some with belated regret. Jonah stood still, as if preparing to leave as soon as the work was done. But before he could turn around, Elias Morrison approached. He said little. He simply placed his hand on his chest and bowed deeply. Jonah responded with a small nod. No further words needed. And as the room fell silent, after the bloodless shock, questions that had never been allowed to exist began to sprout, not just about power, but about what would bind two men who had just stood on the same side of honor. The room didn't erupt after the transaction. It quieted down. Like a lake that had just been hit by a large stone, ripples spread slowly, then receded into stillness. People looked at each other, then up at the platform where the oil lamp hung higher than necessary, shining directly on the signed papers. No more bargaining, no more whispering. Only the steady rhythm of breathing and the feeling that something had shifted in the familiar order of red willow. Clara Morrison stood alone, slightly leaning forward. She didn't step down immediately. Not out of hesitation, but because she understood if she left in silence now, the story would be retold in someone else's way. She had been spoken for too long, and this moment, when the law had temporarily sided with justice, was when she needed to speak in her own voice. She took a step forward. The sound of her shoes on the floor was soft enough to draw the attention of everyone in the room. Clara didn't look at Whitmore first. She looked at the crowd, familiar and unfamiliar faces. People who had bowed and nodded before. Women clasped their hands together. Men who had just withdrawn from what they thought was a harmless game. "There's something," Clara said. Her voice wasn't loud but clear. Not shaky, not hurried. "I need to say it." No one interrupted. Sheriff Crowley stood still. Jonah Gray Elk took a half step back, giving him space. Whitmore didn't sit down. He stood, his hands on the table, like someone accustomed to maintaining the upper hand even though it had just slipped from his grasp. Clara took a breath. Not a deep one. Just enough for the words to come out straight. "I don't belong to any man's balance sheet." The statement wasn't emphasized. It didn't need to. Its weight lay in its simplicity. In this room where everything had just been reduced to numbers, the statement fell like something immeasurable. Clara continued slowly. "What happened tonight has been called by many names. A solution, an agreement, the future. But there's one name that's not allowed, and that's marriage." Some bowed their heads. Some looked up. No one objected. Marriage, Clara said, is when two people choose each other, not when one person is chosen instead. She paused, letting the words find their place. Then she turned to Whitmore. For the first time her gaze met his, not fearful, not defiant. Just the raw, uncompromising gaze of one human being upon another. "You can take the money," she said. "You can keep the documents. But you can't keep my honor." Whitmore pursed his lips. His usual polite smile was absent. He looked at Clara, then at the crowd. He understood perfectly well what was happening. The money was on his side, according to his rules. But what had just slipped from his grasp was something he had never learned to buy: moral recognition. Elias Morrison stood up. That movement for many was even more shocking than Clara's words. For months, Elias had walked with a back hunched over beyond his years. He had entered town hall with his shoulders slumped as if carrying Hollow Creek on his back. Now he stood tall. Not perfect, not younger, but straight. He said nothing immediately. He placed his hands on the armrests of the chair, stood firm, and then looked at his daughter. In his eyes there was no longer the remorse of a father who had allowed something he shouldn't have allowed. Instead, there was something deeper: respect. "My daughter," Elias said, his voice low, "kept this family afloat when I couldn't." He looked around. "If anyone thinks they can put a price on that, they've never truly understood us." There was no applause, but nods appeared, slow, scattered, then more distinct. An elderly man in the back row took off his hat and held it to his chest. A woman gently held the hand of the person next to her. Small gestures. But in Red Willow, small gestures are a way of saying big things. Whitmore coughed softly. He adjusted his sleeve cuff. The movements were familiar, the body language of someone accustomed to manipulating the air in a room. But this time, the air didn't follow him. "The transaction has been completed," Whitmore said. "According to the law." "Yes," Crowley replied. "According to the law." Another moment of silence. No confrontation. No drama. Just two identical statements, but carrying two different weights. Clara turned back to the crowd. "I thank those who remained silent when silence was difficult," she said. "And I hope next time we will call out the right thing sooner." She didn't demand anything. She didn't condemn. She simply set a standard, and then let it stand. Jonah, Gray Elk, said nothing. He had done his part. But as Clara descended, walking past him, their eyes met for a very brief moment. No promises, no conditions. Just an acknowledgement between two people who had just stood on the same side of honor without standing side by side on a platform. Whitmore arranged the paperwork. He received the money. He maintained a calm demeanor. But as he turned away, there was something missing in his gait, like a victorious warrior who had lost his map. He had won by the rules, but lost in a way this town would remember. People began to leave. Not loudly. Not in loud chatter. The stories would be told later by the fire in small cafes in low voices. And in those stories, Whitmore's name would be associated with money. Clara Morrison's name would be associated with something more difficult to say: standing tall. Outside town hall, the night wind blew. Clara paused for a moment, taking a breath. The sky stretched out full of stars. Nothing was promising, nothing was guaranteed. But one thing was clear: she had reclaimed her voice not by shouting but by setting boundaries. Elias stood beside his daughter. He didn't put his hand on her shoulder. There was no need. They stood there side by side as they had all their lives, each holding a piece of Hollow Creek. At the edge of the light, Jonah turned away. He didn't expect thanks. Not necessary. The right things rarely require witness. He stepped into the familiar shadows, carrying the quiet reassurance that something had been put back in its place. In the town hall, the oil lamps were lowered. The old order did not collapse, but it cracked. And in that crack, a seed was sown quietly, without haste. Honor in Red Willow has just been called upon. And when honor becomes the collective voice of the town, then, from seemingly unrelated lives, a slow but steady future will begin to find its way. Red Willow didn't wake up the next morning as usual. There was something in the air, invisible, unnameable, but enough to make people speak more softly, walk more slowly. Stories from the night before had spilled over, not with laughter or excitement, but with long pauses between sentences. The name Jonah Gray Elk was mentioned with new caution. And the name, Harold Whitmore, was no longer spoken in the same way. Whitmore wasn't used to that. He sat in his bank office, the door closed, the morning light slanting across his desk. $10,000 had been recorded. The paperwork was in order. The law on the surface had worked perfectly. But in Whitmore something was not still, not an outburst of anger. Rather a deep, quiet chill, the chill of someone whose untouchable possession had been violated. Honor. He was defeated not in court but in front of the entire town, and Whitmore wasn't the type to accept that. That afternoon, Sheriff Crowley received a new document. Not an offer, not a plea, an accusation. Jonah Gray Elk is suspected of illegally acquiring gold. Its origin is unclear. The transaction shows signs of fraud. The document is written in the cold language of law, vague enough not to require immediate proof, yet sharp enough to deeply wound a man's life. Crowley finished reading, saying nothing. He set the paper down on the table, took off his glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He'd been a cop long enough to understand this was how power retaliated when it couldn't win openly. Whitmore didn't need to lie. He just needed to ask the questions, and the law would do the rest. Rumors spread even before an official order was issued. People said Jonah had kept gold that didn't belong to him. Some whispered that the gold couldn't have come from honest labor. Others recalled Jonah's past, a warrior, a life outside the white rule of law, and pieced together the fragments into a more believable story. Clara heard the news while hanging clothes out on the Hollow Creek porch. A neighbor stopped by, his voice hesitant, his eyes averting when Jonah's name was mentioned. Clara didn't react immediately. She continued folding the clothes, carefully placing each one down, as if slowing down would make things less serious. But when the neighbor left, Clara sat down on the steps, her hands resting on her knees. She understood what was happening. Whitmore couldn't get back what he'd lost with money. So he was using the law, the weapon he knew best. Elias Morrison noticed the change even before Clara. He saw the horsemen passing by Hollow Creek moving slower than usual. He saw the police visiting town more often. He saw the wariness returning to the eyes of those who had bowed respectfully the night before. "It's not over yet," Elias said softly, as father and son sat down for dinner. "Not a complaint, just a truth called out." Clara nodded. "I know." Jonah Gray Elk wasn't in Red Willow when the rumors started. He'd left town early the morning after the ceremony, as he usually did after a necessary task was completed. He wasn't running away. He just didn't want to stay where attention didn't bring him any good. When Crowley found Jonah on the edge of the low hills where the wind was stronger and footprints were more easily erased, Jonah knew. No lengthy explanation needed. No formal arrest warrant required. Just by looking into Crowley's eyes, Jonah understood that the law had been called upon not for protection but to reclaim control. "They say I stole the gold," Jonah said, his voice even. Crowley nodded. "They said a lot of things." Jonah didn't smile. He gazed into the distance where the horizon blended into the earth. "I don't take anything that doesn't belong to me." Crowley believed him. "But trust isn't always enough." "Whitmore wants him gone," Crowley said. "Or at least enough trouble to get him out of his sight." Jonah nodded, not surprised. He'd lived long enough to understand that when power is challenged, it will find a way back to its former place, not necessarily right, just strong enough. Meanwhile, Hollow Creek began receiving unspoken signals. An anonymous letter mentioning the safety of the farm. A stranger inquiring about buying the land at an unusually low price. A message sent through an intermediary stating that Whitmore had not forgotten. Clara read the letter, then burned it. Not out of fear, but because she refused to let those threats have a place in her home. But she also understood Whitmore didn't strike quickly. He wore people down. He dragged things out. He made others so tired that they gave up on their own. Night fell. The wind blew through Hollow Creek again. Clara sat by the window watching the oil lamp flicker. She thought of Jonah, of the man who had emerged from the shadows, done the right thing, only to be pulled back into the grayness of the law. She felt an unyielding anxiety, a slow, creeping feeling like a chill seeping into her bones. Elias placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "I don't want you to think that standing tall is pointless." Clara shook her head. "I don't think so." She looked outside. but I know that standing tall is never an easy path." In Red Willow, Whitmore continued to appear in public. He shook hands. He smiled. He spoke of order and stability. But something in his eyes had changed, sharper, more wary. He was no longer thinking only of profit. He was thinking of suppressing a dangerous precedent that someone could enter his game, play by his rules, and still not belong to him. This war doesn't involve guns drawn in the streets. There's no shouting. It takes place on paper, in offices, in whispers. And that's precisely why it's more dangerous. Clara understood that from the moment Jonah placed the bag of gold on the table, not only Hollow Creek was saved, a line had been crossed. And Whitmore wouldn't let that happen again without making the price high enough. Before going to bed, Clara opened the door and looked up at the sky. The stars were still there, unchanged, unconcerned by human rules. She told herself in a voice only she could hear, this war is not over. But she also knew something else, something deeper, something more solid. That once honor has been publicly acknowledged, it cannot be dragged back into the shadows completely. And when power begins to act in silence, those who once stood alone will be forced to decide, continue to bow their heads for safety, or stand closer together to protect what has just been awakened. The water in Ash Creek is never obvious. It doesn't rush forth like in the east, nor does it rise proudly like the great rivers. Here the water flows quietly hidden beneath the earth, seeping through ancient rock formations, and only revealed to those who patiently dig deep. Longtime residents of this region understand that whoever controls the water doesn't need to control people, for people will find their way to it. Jonah Gray Elk understood that from a very young age. He sat by the bank of the small creek north of Hollow Creek when he first spoke the truth. It wasn't quite dark yet. A gentle breeze rippled the water in small circles, then dispersed. Clara and Elias sat opposite him on flat rocks. There were no papers spread out, no maps laid out, just three people and something that had been buried too long. Whitmore wasn't just a banker, Jonah said. His voice was even devoid of bitterness. He was the one who held the reins of power. Elias frowned. "The water here belongs to the region," he said. "By law." Jonah nodded. "By law, yes." He bent down, picked up a pebble and tossed it gently into the creek. "But the law doesn't say who was the first to register. And Whitmore registered very early on." Clara listened. She didn't interrupt. She had learned that some stories need to be told at the rhythm of the person carrying them in their heart. Years ago, Jonah continued, when the railroad lines started to open, Whitmore bought up some neglected land. Dry land. Bad land. Land east of Hollow Creek. He looked at Elias. Place everyone thought was useless. Elias was silent. He remembered. He remembered being offered to buy that piece of land at a suspiciously low price. He had refused, thinking he had nothing to lose. "Beneath those lands," Jonah said, "lies the most stable groundwater in the Ash Creek area." He paused, letting his words settle. Whitmore didn't dig. He didn't need to. He just needed the title. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She began to see the bigger picture, not just of Hollow Creek but of the entire area. And when the drought came, Jonah continued, when the farms started borrowing money to survive. Whitmore didn't sell water. He lent it. He looked up. "On condition." Elias exhaled slowly. "Exploitation rights." Jonah nodded. "And when the debt isn't repaid, the land changes hands. But the water remains in his hands." The silence dragged on. No one needed further proof to understand that they had lived under a system built long ago, not by violence, but by the cold patience of someone who knew the law better than anyone else. Clara broke the silence. "The land east of Hollow Creek. He bought it." Jonah looked at her. "I've put my name on it." Elias looked at him, genuinely surprised for the first time. When, before the ceremony, Jonah replied, even before Whitmore thought about forcing her into marriage, Jonah recounts that he used part of his gold, accumulated from years of work as a translator from irregular wages, from unacknowledged jobs, to buy the land. Not for profit, not for speculation, but to erect a shield. "If Hollow Creek is dammed," Jonah said, "the land to the east will become the legal boundary. Water cannot be monopolized if the source is outside of Whitmore's land." Clara closed her eyes for a moment. She understood why Jonah had said no demands at the auction. He wasn't buying Hollow Creek, he was breaking through the encirclement. He knew Whitmore would retaliate, Clara said. Jonah nodded. Power never surrenders without leaving its teeth marks. The alliance began to form from there, not with oaths, not with solemn handshakes, but with meetings by the fireplace, with papers spread out on the table. Elias brought out old ledgers, receipts, and rudimentary maps that his family had kept for years. Jonah brought his knowledge of the law, of how small clauses could open up large loopholes. Sheriff Crowley joined later informally. He didn't sit long, he didn't say much. But he pointed out things the court would ask, points Whitmore had overlooked because he trusted too much in the silence of others. Clara took notes. She wrote, slowly, carefully. Each line was an act of reclaiming not land, but the right to know. She realized that this war didn't need guns. It needed patience, and people willing to trust each other in a world accustomed to betrayal. Whitmore will say we're making it up, Elias said one evening as the wind blew strongly on the porch. He'll say it's a conspiracy. Jonah looked at the fire. The truth doesn't need to shout, he said. It just needs to stand firm when asked. In the days that followed, water became a topic no one spoke of openly, yet everyone thought about it. The farmers began to look east toward Hollow Creek with different eyes. Conversations in the pub shifted from cattle prices to the right to use the creek to contracts they had previously signed without reading them carefully. Whitmore sensed this shift. He began appearing more frequently at Red Willow, talking about stability, about responsible investing. But his words now met with something else. Skepticism had taken root. Clara stood by the well one morning watching the water reflect the sky. She thought about how water flows without confrontation, without struggle, yet it always finds its way. She understood that what they were doing was the same. They weren't trying to overthrow Whitmore overnight. They were simply letting the truth seep through, layer by layer, the hard soil of fear and habit. Jonah prepared to leave Hollow Creek on a quiet afternoon. He wasn't carrying much. Before leaving, he stood on the eastern side of the property, looking toward Morrison Farm. "This isn't a gift," he said to Clara. "This is repayment." Clara nodded. "We'll keep it properly." Jonah smiled very slightly. "I know." When he left, there was no sense of loss, only the feeling that a part of the story had been put in its place so that the rest could continue. Beneath Ash Creek, the water flows, silently, without asking permission. And in truth it does. And when what has been buried begins to surface in ways no one can deny, the question is no longer who holds power, but who has the courage to live truthfully when power is shaken. Red Willow had never been accustomed to the presence of outside law. The town had grown up on verbal agreements, firm handshakes, and an informal system where power preceded justice. Therefore, when two black-painted carriages stopped before Town Hall on a cloudy morning, it was obvious without question something had spiraled out of control. The men in long coats stepped down first. They were quiet. They didn't look around, seeking attention. They walked straight, their steps, even their shoes, spotless. On the small badge on their lapel, the metal reflected a light that didn't belong to Red Willow. U.S. Marshals. The name alone was enough to straighten the backs of those accustomed to bowing their heads. Following them was an older man, tall and thin, with neatly trimmed gray hair. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried an old leather briefcase. He didn't look like someone who had come to cause a scene. But when he removed his hat and entered the town hall, the atmosphere in the room changed, not with fear but with a feeling very rare in this place: order. Judge Samuel Harding didn't speak immediately. He glanced around the room as if reading a note without paper. His gaze rested on the podium, on the desk, on the front row of seats. He didn't look at Whitmore first. That made Whitmore more uneasy than any direct eye contact. "We're here at the request of a federal court," Harding said, his voice low, clear, and without emphasis, "concerning water rights, land records, and financial transactions at Red Willow." That statement wasn't accusatory. It merely named the scope. But to those in the know, that scope was broad enough to encompass everything Whitmore had constructed. Whitmore stood up. He was used to commanding the room, used to speaking before anyone could understand what he was saying. But this time he slowed down a beat. Not long enough to be seen as weak, but long enough to reveal caution. "I'm ready to cooperate," Whitmore said. The familiar smile returned thinner than before. "Red Willow Bank has always complied with the law." "We'll confirm that," Harding replied. No argument, no sarcasm. The U.S. Marshals began their work. Not quickly, not hastily. They opened filing cabinets, placing stacks of papers on the long table in the middle of the room. They took notes. They made notes. They asked short, precise questions without suggesting answers. For the first time, Whitmore couldn't control the rhythm. He stood there watching the papers that had once been his weapons being flipped over. The small clauses, once written in faint ink placed at the bottom of the page, were now brought to light. Water rights were transferred indirectly through shell companies. Useless plots of land were registered under third parties, then returned to the bank through indirect means. Loans were conditionally extended, conditions that suspiciously coincided with the drought. Sheriff Crowley stood at the edge of the room. He didn't intervene, not needed. This time the law didn't need local patronage. It would walk on its own. Witnesses were called in, not all at once, one by one. An elderly farmer spoke about a contract he had signed without reading it carefully, trusting the bank's advice. A woman recounted how her well gradually dried up after the eastern plot of land changed hands. A trader admitted to being encouraged to act as a nominee, with the promise of no trouble. Clara Morrison sat in the back row. She wasn't called upon immediately. It wasn't necessary. Her presence in the room wasn't to tell her story, but to bear witness to something larger, that what had happened wasn't an isolated incident. Elias sat beside his daughter. He held her hand very gently. For the first time in months, his breathing was not heavy. Jonah Gray Elk is mentioned in the records. His name appears not as a suspect, but as someone holding a piece that completes the picture. When the question about the gold was raised, Harding didn't look at Whitmore. He looked at Crowley. "Has the source been verified?" Harding asked. "Yes," Crowley replied. "Legal labor, legal pay, no signs of misappropriation." Whitmore clenched his jaw. He was about to say something, then stopped. This time words were no longer a safe option. The hearing lasted longer than expected. The light outside the window changed color. Oil lamps were lit. Town Hall, once the scene of a marketplace of human dignity, now became a place where numbers were put in their proper place, not to value people, but to measure truth. When Clara was finally called up, Harding asked only one question. "Were you coerced into signing any prenuptial agreements in exchange for financial benefits?" Clara answered briefly, "Yes." No further details. Not needed. Harding nodded, taking notes. Noted. Whitmore looked away. The investigation wasn't over in a day. Harding made that clear. But some conclusions didn't need time to form. When he stood up, the entire room stood with him, not out of formality, but out of a long-standing habit of reacting to matters that couldn't be taken lightly. During the investigation, Harding said all transactions relating to water and land rights held in the name of Red Willow Bank will be suspended. Records will be sealed. Witnesses will be protected. A pause. "No one here has been convicted today," he continued. "But no one is outside of scrutiny either." Whitmore stood motionless. He understood. This wasn't an immediate defeat, but it was a loss of control. For a man like him, that was the deepest blow. When Harding and the marshals left, the room fell silent. People watched them go, then looked at each other. A strange feeling spread, not victory but relief. Like when a long-suffering fever is finally given its proper name. Clara stepped outside. The clouds had cleared. Late afternoon light fell on the main street. She stood still for a moment to process what had just happened, not only with her mind but with her body. This feeling was not joy. It was more like a belated acknowledgement that their pain had been seen. Elias stood beside him. He said nothing. He just breathed steadily. Whitmore was the last to leave Town Hall. He didn't look at anyone. His steps were still firm, but there was no longer the rhythm of a leader, only the rhythm of someone forced to follow. Clara knew the fight wasn't over. Law was slow to act. Resistance to power was persistent. But today, for the first time, the law had entered Red Willow not as a tool of the strong, but as an unavoidable question. And sometimes in towns that have long lived in silence, the right question is enough to change the way people walk into tomorrow. And when justice arrives, even if only one step, those who once stood alone will begin to believe that the truth, if upheld, can open the path to healing. Harold Whitmore was arrested on a morning with no rain, no wind, and no warning signs of an event that would go down in Red Willow's memory as a whisper that would linger on forever. There were no crowds gathered, no sound of metal clashing against wrists, no one shouting his name. Only 2 U.S. Marshals stood outside the Red Willow Bank, the red brick building that had once been a symbol of order and stability, and a man stepped out in a neat coat collar, buttoned hat, fastened as if preparing to attend a routine meeting. Harold Whitmore maintained the air of someone accustomed to inspecting every room he entered. He greeted Sheriff Crowley with a slight nod. He glanced down the main street where a few people stopped by shops pretending to arrange goods, but their eyes never leaving the scene before them. No one cheered, no one applauded, and that's what made the moment more tense than any dramatic arrest. The U.S. Marshals read the arrest warrant in a steady voice, no louder than necessary. Words like abuse of state power land, record fraud, and coercion through financial leverage were spoken slowly like stones placed one by one on the wooden table that once belonged to Whitmore. He didn't object. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. There was only a very brief moment, almost unnoticed, when Whitmore took a deeper breath than usual, as if accepting that the world was finally no longer operating at its own rhythm. The bank doors closed behind him. No loud noises. No clanking of metal bolts. It's just a door closing and a chapter ending. Red Willow did not celebrate. People went about their day's work. Horse-drawn carriages passed through the main street. A woman hung up her laundry on her porch. A man led his horse to the stable. But there was a very small, subtle change, like when the air after a storm becomes clearer even though the scenery remains unchanged. Older people feel it most acutely. They had lived long enough to know that power rarely collapses with a bang. It usually dissolves silently when no one believes the story it once told. In a small shop near Town Hall, someone whispered, "He doesn't walk like he used to." It wasn't because he was ashamed. It was because he was no longer being watched. Clara Morrison stood by the window of Hollow Creek when she heard the news. Elias didn't need to say much. Just a short, hoarse sentence, "They've taken him away." Clara nodded. There was no feeling of triumph, no explosive victory. It was just a moment of silence, like when a noise that had been going on for years finally dies down, revealing other sounds, the wind blowing through the grass, the water flowing beneath the earth, the rhythm of one's own breathing. Elias stepped out onto the porch. He stood tall this time, not out of effort but because no invisible weight had forced him to stoop. "What do you think, Father?" Clara asked. Elias was silent for a long time. Then he said slowly, "I think there are some people who don't need to be dragged away in handcuffs. They just need to be seen for who they are." Clara understood. Whitmore had lived by the image of a respectable man, and that very image crumbled not in court but before the sanity of a community no longer afraid. Sheriff Crowley stopped by Hollow Creek at the end of the day. He brought no news, no papers, only a very human weariness. "He'll have to go to federal court," Crowley said. "It'll take a long time." Clara nodded. "We're not in a hurry." Crowley looked around the farm, the land, the fence, the well. "This place will be quieter." "It's never completely peaceful," Clara replied. "But it's more real." Crowley smiled very slightly. "In Red Willow the bank is temporarily closed. The sign is still hanging there, but no one stands beneath it anymore, confidently assuming they own someone else's future. People started rereading old contracts. They started asking each other about national rights. They started recalling things that were once considered unchangeable. And in those conversations the name Harold Whitmore was gradually mentioned, not with anger but with a deeper, more profound emotion, rousing. Clara met Jonah Gray Elk a few days later on the eastern edge of the estate. No lengthy greetings, no old stories. "He already knows," she said. Jonah nodded. "Power always leaves a void when it leaves." "Do you regret it?" Clara asked. Jonah gazed at the horizon. "No. I just feel sorry that so many people had to endure this for so long to see it." They stood there for a while without saying anything more. It wasn't necessary. Night falls over Ash Creek. The sky was clear. The stars were visible. Clara stepped outside, taking a deep breath. There wasn't a complete sense of closure, but there was a newfound reassurance that what had happened hadn't been swept away in meaningless silence. Harold Whitmore, who once owned banking law and fear, left Red Willow in the quietest way possible. No one saw them off, no one cursed them, and that's what made his downfall complete. Because for those who have lived long enough to understand what true power is, being forgotten in silence is the harshest judgment. And when the shadow of a powerful man finally fades from the prairie, those who once only knew how to survive will begin to learn how to live slowly, kindly, and no longer bowing to fear. That winter arrived later than usual. The snow fell lightly, not heavily, as if the Ash Creek region had grown weary of unnecessary harshness. The town's elders said it was a sign of a year of transition, not a year of abundance, but one long enough for people to slow their breathing and appreciate what they already had. Clara Morrison stood on the porch of Hollow Creek on a cold morning, her hand resting on a worn wooden post. She wasn't there to watch for anything. She simply stood as a newly formed habit to feel the day begin without the fear of being deprived. The wind blew across the prairie, carrying the scent of damp earth and dry grass. Here, such scents were once associated with fear. Now they were associated with the work that needed to be done. Clara became the manager of Hollow Creek, in a very natural way. There were no grand pronouncements, no solemn handover. People in the area simply realized that decisions now passed through her before they took shape. Repairing wells, dividing water, changing farming schedules, all were considered slowly, with the prudence of someone who had learned to weigh the pros and cons of each choice. Elias Morrison still lived in Hollow Creek. He hadn't withdrawn, nor had he regained control as before. Father and daughter worked side by side without much talking. Elias felt lighter, not because age had suddenly taken its toll, but because responsibility was finally being shared in the right way. He looked at his daughter, and for the first time in years, he no longer feared that the family's future would crumble if he fell ill one day. Morrison Farm is gradually becoming a new landmark in the Ash Creek area. It wasn't about getting rich quickly. It wasn't about expanding their territory. It was about how they worked with water. Hollow Creek didn't hoard water for themselves. Clara and Elias, along with their neighbors, forged a simple, handwritten signed agreement to share it, kept at town hall. No vague clauses, no fine print at the bottom of the page, only clear principles. Water belongs to life, not to leverage. People began coming to Hollow Creek, not to beg, but to learn how to organize. Meetings took place around long wooden tables, with hot tea, paper, and pens. No one carried guns. No one raised their voices. Those who had once stood on opposite sides of debt now sat together on one side of the question, how to move on without repeating past mistakes. Red Willow changes slowly, but it changes for real. The bank reopened with new management. The files were re-examined. Some contracts were canceled. Some plots of land were returned. Not everything was immediately fair, but one thing never returned: the blind fear of seals and signatures nobody understood. Clara went into town once a week. She didn't avoid the gaze, nor did she seek attention. People greeted her with a nod, with practical questions. What was being grown this season? Was there enough water? How much was the grass? It was a quiet kind of respect, a respect that lasted longer than compliments. Jonah Gray Elk wasn't in Hollow Creek all the time. He had his own paths, his own places to go, other communities, learning to stand tall. But he returned regularly, not on a fixed schedule. Each time he came, he brought news, sometimes a new map, sometimes just the quiet presence of someone who had seen enough and needed no further explanation. Between Jonah and Clara, no promises were made. There is no question of, what are we? There is no pre-drawn plan for our shared future. They worked side by side. They exchanged ideas. They listened. On long afternoons, as the sunlight slanted across the prairie, they stood watching the water flow through the eastern land that had once been their exclusive property, now a protected boundary. Their trust needed no name. It's present in the way Jonah doesn't make decisions for Clara, in the way Clara asks Jonah for his opinion without waiting for permission, in those comfortable silences, a silence that can only exist when no one needs to prove anything. Older audiences, if they saw them, wouldn't call it romantic. They would call it something more familiar: companionship. One late winter evening, Clara and Elias sat by the fireplace. The wind was strong outside, but it was warm inside. Elias looked at his daughter for a long time, then said, "I once thought your future had been taken away." Clara placed the log in the fire and adjusted the flame. "I used to think the same thing, and now," Clara thought for a moment. "Now I think, the future doesn't need to be big. It just needs to be real." Elias nodded. He understood. He had lived his whole life making big promises, and it was the little things that kept him grounded. Spring arrived, not in splendor, but steadily. The water flowed calmly. The grass grew slowly. The people of Ash Creek began to get used to consulting each other before making decisions that affected the entire region. Not because of a binding law, but because they had seen the consequences of not doing so. Hollow Creek didn't become a legend. It's not remembered as the place that defeated a powerful man. It's remembered as the place that chose a different way to live and had the patience to hold on to that choice through the seasons. One afternoon Jonah was preparing to leave. He stood by the gate looking at Clara. "I will return," he said. "Not a promise. Just the truth." Clara nodded. "We'll stay here. No hugs, no extra words." They understood that the strongest bonds don't need grand gestures. As Jonah disappeared down the dirt road, Clara turned to look back at Hollow Creek. That farm had once been on the brink of collapse. It had once been put up for auction. It had once been saved by things that were not originally planned. And now it existed as something that shouldn't have existed, yet it was very much alive. Evening fell. The stars appeared one by one. Clara stood still, not because she was waiting, but because she knew that tomorrow would come with things to do, and she was ready. In Ash Creek, the future is not promised. It is built slowly by people who choose to live decent lives when no one forces them to. And sometimes it is precisely these futures that should never have existed, that are most worth preserving. The story Rancher's Daughter was being auctioned to the highest bidder when a Lakota warrior intervened is not just about a bygone era. It touches on a question that many of us at any age have faced. Where does a person's value lie when everything around them can be put on a price? Clara Morrison didn't win by strength. She didn't win by eloquent arguments. She won by refusing to let anyone decide her worth for her. Jonah Gray Elk is not a hero in the flashy sense. He doesn't save anyone through violence. He simply uses his integrity, intelligence, and a memory of the kindness he has received. And that reminds us that true power does not lie in controlling others, but in the ability to stand firm when doing the right thing doesn't bring immediate benefits. In modern life, we may not be standing on an auction platform, but we are still valued every day by money, titles, achievements, or the approval of others. This story reminds us honor isn't something to be defended with fists, but with choices we make every day. Quiet acts of kindness can come back after years in ways we never expected, and sometimes the best future is the one we once thought we didn't deserve. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If what I've just shared resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling and listening to slow, kind, and very human stories. See you in the next story.